Maryland's biggest surprise of fall camp is huge for the Terps.
You are Locked On Terps, your daily podcast on the Maryland Terps, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everyone? I'm Tre Moore, host of Locked On Terps, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So thank you for making us part of your day. And today's episode is brought to you by the Gametime app. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. The biggest surprises of fall camp is amazing for the Terps. I have to thank Inside Black and Gold for some of the reporting that they came out and doing this, some of these questions about Maryland football online and putting them up about how Coach Locksley responded to a lot of these different things. So I want to make sure to give credit to Ahmad and all that he does at Inside Black and Gold. And I was reading his article, and one of the questions was about guys that have stood out in fall camp. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. And I was going through the names that Coach Locksley was talking about. And when a coach brings up specific players that out of his entire team of who knows how many exact players are on the exact roster, but out of all the players and all the walk-ons that he could bring up, he decides to talk about a couple of specific guys. That's something that's important. That's something that is big news. That's something that's not just your automatic coach response. A lot of these questions, when you ask coaches and even when you ask players, you get a lot of that automatic response where it's kind of a computer response. They're programmed to kind of tell you, oh, yes, this, and to make it sound good. But when they give you a couple guys that are standing out, that are names that not everybody talks about, and are names that are maybe more depth players, not quite starters, out of all the entire players on your football team, I don't know the exact number on the team when you include the walk-ons and everything, but when you look at that and he brings out a couple of names, that's extremely important. And so a couple of the guys that he mentioned, I think if they're playing well and they're doing their thing for Maryland football, it could be really great for this team, for depth, and just for guys that can come in and play and give us good minutes at position groups that honestly have been weak in a lot of the ones that he mentions. So the first name he mentioned was actually a tight end, but it wasn't Preston Howard or Dylan Wade. It was actually Leon Houghton, who is one, and consider probably our third or fourth tight end, depending on where you kind of look in the depth chart. I think Preston and Dylan Wade are clearly the 1 and 2, and then AJ Sininsky and Leon are both kind of right there. But I've been talking about the fact that we don't have a lot of tight end depth. If something happens to Preston Howard, if something happens to Dylan Wade, I don't know how the room would look. So the fact that Coach Locksley is saying, yeah, Leon Houghton has looked really good. His quote is, I'd say someone who's jumped out is Leon Houghton. He's been really good. He's been one of those guys that I think has strengthened us in the tight end room. So that's an important player that I think definitely has a role somewhere in this offense in terms of, number one, he's a depth piece. He's probably not going to be as explosive as a target as a Dylan Wade or a Preston Howard or a lot of the weapons that we have on the outside, Ty Felton or Caden Prather. But injuries do happen, as well as you can run 3 tight end sets. We run a lot of 2 tight end sets, and sometimes Wade and Howard aren't always going to be on the field, and you're going to want to get different bodies in there just to rest. So the fact that Leon Houghton has looked good in camp is huge for the depth in that tight end room, which was one of my biggest concerns because I just felt like there was not a lot of depth. I felt like there was not a lot of pass catchers outside of the starting 2. So I think the fact that Leon Houghton has stood out at Maryland camp really helps this offense round out the tight end room, which I think is something that is really important for the Terps. And then he talked about some other guys, and he talked about some of the young freshman offensive linemen up front who he pretty much said have come in and played really high-level football. He talked about Tre Davis, he says, has been one of those guys. He talked about Michael Hershey and Anthony Robsock have all played well, and Trevor Sininsky, who's the brother of A.J. Sininsky, who plays tight end. So he mentioned a bunch of guys on that offensive line. And the important part about it is he said they're kind of going to be a lot of our depth pieces or a lot of the young guys up front. And he said, yeah, these guys, this is his quote, those guys have put themselves to where they've opened up some eyes. And so it's an interesting thing when he talks about the offensive line and how these freshmen have played really well. Because usually when you think about young players and guys that are up front, especially on the offensive. You think about this on the defensive line as well. It's tough to play up there. It is really tough to come in. That's the hardest position to come into college right away and play at a high level. So the fact that Tre Davis and Anthony Robsock and Michael Hershey and Trevor Sininsky are all guys that have been playing well, that's pretty good, because this is what he said. This is why it's so important. We're going to need them in what I call our 2.5 deep, where we've got a group of starters, but some guys we've got to develop. And so not only is that super important for the future, yes, but 2.5 deep means that potentially a guy like Tre Davis could be a second stringer. I expect one of the freshman linemen to be maybe a second stringer, and those are guys that are travel. Those are guys that have potential if injury hits your offensive line, or if it's just going that bad up front with all the 5 new starters, maybe they could go a young direction. I don't know exactly, but I do know that it's important that they're standing out at camp. One, for the future of the offensive line, which I think is super bright. When you talk about all those 2024s, when you talk about Terps, he didn't mention Ryan Howerton, but he was our highest rated recruit on the offensive line. And when he talks about Robsock, when he talks about Michael Hershey, all those different guys, those are guys that are going to make up the future of our offensive line. And then you get into the 2025s with Jalen Gilchrist, 4-star top 100 player. And so I feel pretty good about the future. I don't feel great about our offensive line right now, but I feel good about the future of it, and us being able to develop some guys up there and potential guys that could play in the next couple of years. But it's also important this year for depth. Everybody knows that injuries across your offensive line seem to happen every year. I feel like every year there's a story in the NFL or in the college football about how many different combinations some teams have to use sometimes, just because there's always going to be different things, injuries, people not playing well, and you always have to be able to maneuver it around. So the fact that those guys are playing well, and he said it, I think he called it 2.5 depth, which is interesting way to put it. But the fact that they're going to be part of the depth, I don't think any of them will probably play, but they have the potential to maybe play up front. So I think that is another thing that is really important for Maryland's camp and the success of our team in the future and right now. Depth on the offensive line, even if it's young guys. And then he said defensively, and this is something that I am excited about. He said defensively, the young corners, Humes, one of the freshmen we brought in, Kerm Humes, and Braden Lee, are guys that are fighting and competing. So that is another interesting part where he talked about 2 of the young corners, and Kevin Humes and Braden Lee, 2 guys that are really good players and have the potential. They were really highly level recruits, and I think are really good players. And the only thing I would say about Braden Lee, every time they post a clip on Instagram of the offense, I feel like it's always somebody beating Braden Lee. But besides that, I know that they really like Braden Lee, and I know they really like Humes. So that's important because our secondary is questionable in the cornerback room. So those are 2 young guys that, yeah, not only are they going to come in and potentially be starters down the road, yes, for sure, but they're going to keep the starting corners. Jalen Husky, who's supposed to be really good from Bowling Green, but Perry Fisher, who hasn't played a lot of corner, they're going to keep those guys on their toes, which I think is a really important thing for the Terps. You don't want those guys to get comfortable. A couple new starters up there. You don't want those guys to get comfortable. You want them to continue to compete. And the easiest way for them to continue to compete and feel like their job, they don't have a grasp on it, is to have two young, highly recruits right behind them fighting for those spots. And as well as it's depth pieces, those guys will probably be like second stringers in our corner room. And don't be surprised to see them pretty early on. So I think that Leon Houghton, all the depth on the offensive line, Braden Lee and Humes all make up important depth for Maryland football. The Virginia game is extremely important and is arguably the most important game of the year again. I will talk about that after this ad from the Gametime app. Have you ever wanted to go to a game at the last minute like a Maryland Terrapins game, but finding tickets is hard? I've been there before. Buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. Gametime is a fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guaranteed, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun you'll have. Gametime has deals on tickets right up to the start of an event and even an hour after it starts. It's the place to find last-minute seats and take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. The Virginia game is another game that I think is really important, and there's a couple different dynamics to it that continue to be important for us to be better than Virginia. Last year, I thought that the fact that we beat Virginia in the second game of the season last year, in a really big game, and Virginia's technically not in the DMV. The actual school is technically not in the DMV. But when we think of DMV as a more broad spectrum in terms of recruiting, you think of it as a more broad type of thing. It's less about the actual legitimately DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia area. It's more of a broad thing when you think about recruiting and stuff. But when we think about Virginia, it's right down the street in terms of it's a couple hours away. It's one of the closest schools that we are going to play. And I just think that the Virginia game continues to be really important. This year, it's a third game in our season, and it could be the turning point. There could be a lot of different ways that the season could potentially go on from that Virginia game. I said the Michigan State game is probably the most important game in terms of the second game of the season. That could really define how the trajectory of the year goes. But when I think about the Virginia game, it could be really important for a couple of different things. If we some reason drop one to Michigan State, then you got to look at the Virginia game and you say, okay, Maryland, that's a must-win game against Virginia. If we beat Michigan State, I wouldn't quite say the Virginia game's a must-win. It's not a Big Ten game, but I think there's another reason behind it that you look at that you really want to beat that Virginia team. So if you lose against Michigan State and you're 1-1, the Virginia game's a must-win game. You have to. You can't drop 1 and 2 to start the first 3 games of the season and the first part of your schedule, which is supposed to be much easier. And I know that Virginia team's going to be improved with Tony Elliott as their coach. I think he's probably done a pretty good job of building that program up, and their quarterback going into year 2. We got him as a freshman last year. And the thing about their quarterback is I thought he showed a couple of flashes where I was like, oh, that's a big time throw, or, oh, he rifled that one in there. And I think that their quarterback he's an interesting type of talent. But the reason why I say, even if we beat Michigan State, yeah, if we drop from the Virginia on the road, would it be the end of the season? Would it be horrible? Like, maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But I think when I think about how Maryland recruited the state of Virginia this year, how Maryland's 2025 class recruited in the state of Virginia, I think it's important for us to continue to beat Virginia, to continue to win over recruits in Virginia. And I think a big part of that is us actually being better than Virginia. I think that's the reason right now we were able to land two of the top rated players in the state of Virginia that everybody wanted. And when you look at it and when you look down the rankings and when you look at where the players in the state of Virginia are going, the top guys, it isn't the UVA. And I think a big part of that is because they haven't been particularly good. They haven't been able to. One thing is I think we've been better than them. I think that's why we've beat out a couple teams, like even Virginia Tech as well. I mean, Virginia Tech has the potential to be really good this year, but I think we've had 3 straight really solid years, and I think that's a big reason why we're recruiting the state of Virginia really well. It's because we've beaten UVA, and we're doing a really good job, and our program has been in a better spot. And so look at the recruiting rankings in the state of Virginia. Jalen Gilchrist is the number 3rd ranked player in the state of Virginia. He's a top 100 player rated nationally. He's going to Maryland. Messiah Delhomme is the 4th ranked player in the state of Virginia. He's going to Maryland. So we got 3 of the top 5 players, or 2 of the top 5, players in the state of Virginia. University of Virginia has 0. You have to go all the way down to 14 before Virginia gets their first recruit. And obviously, it's not all the Maryland-Virginia game that is the reason why that we're beating them. It's because we're beating them out in recruiting, is because we beat them on the football field. That's not all of it. But I think it's important when you go to recruit and when they're in the state of Virginia, which is pretty close to Maryland, and it's a state you want to recruit pretty hard. And when you go to them and you say, look, we've been better than Virginia. We've been able to have more success over the last couple of years than Virginia. We've beaten Virginia twice in the last 2 years. And I think when you can go to the 2026 class, if you can recruit Virginia like you did for the 2025 class, I think that's important. I think you can bring up, we beat Virginia. So either way, I think the Virginia game is going to be really important. Whether you drop that game to Michigan State, which I'm not saying we do, but if for some reason we do, then it's just a must win because we can't start the season 1-2. Or this first part of the schedule is too easy. But if we beat Virginia, or if we beat Michigan State, we still really want to beat that. Virginia team. It's still going to be extremely important to beat that Virginia team. So I think it goes both ways. And I talked about it last year. I said the Virginia game is super important because of the concept of the recruiting, and they try to go into Maryland to get guys. We trying to go into Virginia to get guys, and all those different things makes Virginia an extremely important game. And I still think that it's a really important game for the Terps in terms of we have to compete in that game because we really need to start the season off the right way. So and purely talking about this season, the game's extremely important. Every game's really important, but that could be a turning point. If you start the season, if you lose to Michigan State, it's like, okay, fine, you have to beat Virginia. But if you somehow drop both, then things are going to start to get trouble really quick. But if you win both, then you're in a spot that you want to be. So I think the Virginia game is really interesting because I think there's a couple different dynamics to it. I think there's a recruiting dynamic to it, as well as I think there's the actual season part where it's a game that we should probably win even though we're on the road. But I think it's an important game after the Michigan State game. I think is actually really interesting. How does Maryland's 2025 class compare to the other Big Ten schools? Does this class have a chance to compete for a Big Ten title later on? I'll talk about that right now. So the Maryland 2025 class, obviously, we've talked about it a ton, and I'm going to keep talking about it because I think it's a really special class. But how does it actually compare to other teams in the Big Ten? Because at the end of the day, you could have a special class, but you got to recruit at a high level in the Big Ten to continue to be at the top of your game, to continue to be a top team in the Big Ten. And when I look at Maryland's 2025 class, when I look at the other teams in the Big Ten, it is in a good spot. I really do think, I really think that it's in the right kind of spot that we want to be. And so I'm looking through, and it's the 8th highest rated class in the Big Ten. And then, of course, it's the 23rd ranked class overall. So it's interesting. And then when I look at the Big Ten schools ahead of us, I'm like, okay, that's fair. That's fair. That's basically all fair. Then when I look at the teams behind us, some of the teams that are behind us have been good programs in the past. So I think that if we can continue to recruit at a high level, we should be at a pretty good spot in the Big Ten. And for some reference, there's now 18 teams in the Big Ten. So here's kind of how it looks. Of course, you go Ohio State's number one in recruiting right now. They're at its really special level. They have a lot of really high-level type of guys. They have 4 or 5 stars, and then they have 16 4-stars. Like, that's a pretty crazy class. And then Oregon as well. They have 3 5-stars, 10 4-stars, another really special class. Michigan doesn't have quite the star power that those schools have. They're at 3, but they have a bunch of 4-stars, 12 4-stars. Same with Penn State at 13 4-stars. And then USC is right behind them with 12 4-stars and 1 5-star. And then Washington's put together a good class with 8 4-stars. And then you look at Rutgers and Maryland, both pretty close. Rutgers just has a bunch more 3-star recruits, but we have the same amount of 4-stars. Rutgers has been recruiting at a really high level, which has been kind of weird because they haven't been like particularly good at a lot of the times. But for some reason, this 2025 class, Rutgers like stepped it up. But I mean, we kind of did too as well. And so Maryland's right behind Rutgers. So we're behind Ohio State, makes sense. We're behind Oregon, makes sense. Behind Michigan, behind Penn State, behind USC, behind Washington, behind Rutgers. So there's a couple schools that I would be like in that top 8 that I want to be ahead of. Like I want to be ahead of Rutgers. I would like to potentially get ahead of Washington, but that's not easy. But the schools behind us have also been schools that have recruited at a pretty high level in the past. Like Wisconsin's behind us, Nebraska's behind us. Nebraska's done a pretty good job recruiting over the with the Matt Rule area. UCLA's behind us, Michigan State's behind us. Everybody else is behind us. And so we're behind the blue bloods like the USC, Penn State, Michigan, Oregon, Ohio State, and a couple of the mediocre teams. Washington, they're in an interesting kind of spot, and Rutgers. But I think that's in a really good spot to be in. Maybe our recruiting, the 2025 class, is really good. Maybe it doesn't quite get us to Big Ten championship type of level, but I think it's like top 25 level. If you recruit at a top 8 kind of clip in the Big Ten, and maybe you can go up even a little bit more, I think that's going to put you in potential to be a team that is a top 25 team consistently. Like I kind of compare it to how Wisconsin has been at times or how Iowa has been at times. I feel like Iowa, like I never think of Iowa as like anything like particularly crazy. Like I don't ever think of them as a team that's going to win a national championship, but I always think of them as a team that's consistently in the top 25, consistently in a really good bowl game. They played Tennessee last year in a bowl game, so really solid bowl game. And I always think of them as a team that's well coached. They're really good on the defense side of things. The offense has been a struggle, but you can't have everything. And so I think about Iowa as a really solid program that a lot of people care about their program. With the new extended playoff, could Iowa potentially make a playoff? Maybe. And so I think of them as that kind of way. And I think Maryland, if they keep recruiting at a top 25 type of level, there's no reason you're shouldn't be a top 25 team. If you use the portal right, if you get guys in the portal, I really like this Maryland team in the 2025 class. And I think that when you look at the recruiting rankings, where we've been in the past and how well we've played in the past in these last couple of years, where we've been in like, sometimes we've been around the 40s and sometimes we've been in the middle of the 30s. And so when I look at this class and we're hitting a top 23 type of class and a top 8 class in the Big Ten, I look at it and I say, if the coaching staff can develop the team right, if we can get the right pieces in the right spots, then the Terps are going to be a good team in the future. And I think we're going to be similar to an Iowa, similar to a Wisconsin. Like Wisconsin, for a little bit, it felt like they were consistently a top 25 team. And you might have a year where Wisconsin was like, there was a year where like Wisconsin was like 3rd or 2nd in the country at a point. And so I can see Maryland fitting in that kind of mold if they can continue to recruit at this kind of way. So it's interesting. We're not going to be able to recruit at Ohio State type of way, and we're not going to be Ohio State or an Oregon or Michigan. But we can be a tick below that. We can be where Washington has been. Washington made it to the national title last year. So I think it's interesting how it kind of works, but I think we're in a really good spot in recruiting in terms of the 4-stars, in terms of the players that we brought in. But that's all we have for today. Thank you for listening to Locked on Terps. Make sure you like and subscribe. We're here every day talking Maryland football and basketball. So thank you for listening to Locked on Terps.